Hopefully everyone has something to write with or to write certain points down. Pastor really covers a lot in his sermons, and it's near impossible to cover every single thing that he brings out unless you speak for hours on end. But tonight we're in chapter 31, and we're looking at Revelation 13:10, and the title is, "It's a must for world war to prove what sin brings. This message goes to all the world." And this was given on Jacob 26, so 10:6-18. Let's turn to Revelation chapter 13, verse 10, because this has been the title of several sermons that he has given so far that has been covered in previous classes. So just to refresh our minds, and then we'll get into the sermon itself. But it's really interesting the way he tackles this particular verse here, Revelation chapter 13, verse 10. And if you remember some of the previous sermons, he said it looks like this verse has just been thrown in the middle, and then it talks about other things, because if you look at chapter 13 and verses 1 through 8, it's talking about the beast that came out of the sea and the authority coming from the dragon and so forth. And then you have 9 and 10 that talks about he was for captivity. Well, going to captivity, he was for the sword, must be killed with the sword. Herein is the patience and the faith of the saints tested. And then it goes into the second beast that comes out from the earth. So in his previous sermons, he highlighted how this verse was just inserted right in the middle between the first beast and the second beast. And then he went into really defining this verse, showing that herein is referring to this time period known as the last days. But what I would like to focus on is just the word must, because you see in the title of the sermon, it's in quotation marks. And one of the things that pastor does when he gives his sermon, he gives the title for his sermon, for all of his sermons. So even though he doesn't give it to us when he's speaking, very rarely do he ever give it to us while he's up here. But when you're able to get the disc, or you're able to see the titles, he of himself gives the name for his sermon. And what that does, it gives us the ability to listen or read the sermons and to focus on what he wants us to focus on, because there's so many different things that you can get out of pastor's sermon, but you have to ask yourself the question, well, what does he want us to get out of it? And usually the title is what clues you in on what he wants you to really get out of that message. Out of everything that he said, out of all the different points that he covered, what he wants us to get, it's usually in the title, because again, he is the one who names the sermon. So in Revelation 13:10, it says, "It's a must," and must is in quotation marks, "for world war to prove what sin brings. This message goes out to all the world." Now, this word must being highlighted, and it's something that he has emphasized, is something that he has used in the titles of some of his previous sermons. So I'm going to give the definition of the word must, but before I do so, I just want everyone to see the importance of it before we move ahead. So if we go back to, let me get the page number here. So if we look at chapter 29 on page 313, and we're just looking at the title, it says Revelation 13:10, it's a must. So you have that word must there, that the world burns. It's also a must that Yahweh saves the remnant. So you see that's very important. And if you go back to page 300, chapter 28, chapter 28 on page 300, just reading the title again, well, page 289, not 300, but page 289, just reading the title again, it says, Revelation 13:10, well, no, that's the wrong one I'm looking at. So yes, page 300. So chapter 28, it says, "Man refused Yahweh's righteousness. He chose war. It's a must that his choice be shown and brought forth." So you have the word must. And this is not the first time that, pastor has just highlighted one word in a sermon. And, he has encouraged us over and over again that when we are reading and studying the scriptures, that we should look up every word because every word carries meaning. So this word must, and I'm just taking it from dictionary.com, it means to be obliged or bound to by an imperative requirement. And it gives an example, I must keep my word. So it's an imperative, something that you have to do. It also means to be under the necessity to, need to. Example, animals must eat to live. It also means to be required or compelled to, as by the use or threat of force. Example, you must obey the law. It also means to be compelled to in order to fulfill some need or achieve an aim. Example, we must hurry if we are to arrive on time. Another use of the word, it means to be or feel urged to or out to. And an example of this, so I'm just using, they have examples of the word being used in different sentences, and here's another example. It says, I must buy that book. So that's feeling urged or compelled or urged to or to be in that definition. It also means to be inevitably certain to, be compelled by nature, and the example that they gave is everyone must die. So that's word as being when the word must is used as a verb. Now, as an adjective, it means necessary or vital. As a noun, it means something necessary, vital, or required. And the example that they gave here is this law is a must. Now, in Strong's Greek English lexicon, the word must is word number 1210, and it means, now it had such a long list of definitions for that word in must in Thea's Greek English lexicon, word number 1210, and I didn't write every single one of it down, but it says the word must means it is necessary, there's a need of, it behoove, it's right and proper. It means necessity lying in the nature of the case, necessity brought on by circumstances or by the conduct of others towards us, necessity in reference to what is required to attain some end. So when you look at that verse where pastors explained, he said he was for captivity and he was talking about for war. He spoke about in some of the past sermons, for bullying and all that type of stuff. Whatever you're for, that's what you're going to receive. That's what you're going to be. That's what you're going to be expecting. That's what's going to be coming to you. Whatever you're for. Who is for captivity will go into captivity. Who is for the sword? For war, for warfare, for fighting, and whatever it is, will be killed. Or it says must be killed with the sword. So this is a necessity. It's something there to prove a point that Yahweh wants to be proved, that whatever action or activity that we are for, then these are the results that will follow. It must follow, just to prove something so that we could see why Yahweh's way is right. And Pastor really gets into great detail, and that's why this title is, it's a must for world war to prove what sin brings. This message goes to all. And this is something that when you look at what's taking place right now, yes, it is going to be a world war. You can see that the nations are primed for it, but this war, world war, which will be a nuclear war, it is necessary to prove, not just to us, mankind, but to all the beings in the universe, what sin will bring. It's necessary. That's the point that Pastor is trying to get across to us, showing that it is a necessity, that Yahweh saw that it is a necessity for these things to be allowed to take place in this manner. So let's go into verse 2. He says, the news is really great, right? I'm sharing that news. The fights and wars take you over to Revelation 13:10, which we want to continue on with in just a little bit. But while this is on your mind about the Palestinians and the 3.5 years that we're either into or fixing to go into, I'm thinking we're already in them by transferring the United States Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. As Trump said, that takes it off the table. It's no longer an issue. Well, we know now that we were not in the last 3.5 years at that particular time, but we are in the last 3.5 years now. But this move of of the embassy to Jerusalem was necessary to bring about the last 3.5 years. And if you remember the details, they had a waiver that they put in place since 1995, and every 6 months the president would sign that waiver, and then President Trump said, once this is done, they're not going to sign the waiver anymore, and they didn't sign the waiver anymore. It expired, and then the Feast of Pentecost of this year, Pastor announced that we are in the last 3.5 years because they didn't sign the waivers and the move was complete and all the conditions were fulfilled. But at this particular time, he was saying that it is part of that prophecy, or part of this was necessary. The moving of the embassy, it was necessary for it to take place in order for setting the stage for the last 3.5 years to begin. Let's go to verse 8 on page 334. So I'm going to be skipping a lot of the news here because a lot of it deals with the movement of the embassy, the conflict in Jerusalem, Trump recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and there's a lot of details in there. But in verse 8 he says, I want you to write down these dates. You need to keep your own personal records, I think. Start keeping your own personal records on the dates. You'll thank me later. You can use these dates in your sermons, in your teaching, to show how these prophecies came to pass, when they came to pass, and you will have your own notes on them. You can even keep them in the back of your book of Yahweh. And this is really, and if we think about it from the standpoint that Pastor is talking about here, we are eyewitnesses to everything that is taking place in these last days. We'll be able to give that testimony, not just the testimony of the one sent, but our own personal testimony, because we will be witnesses. And if you take that job serious as an eyewitness to the events that are taking place, then you'll have the times, then you'll have the dates, then you'll have the articles. You'll have everything to back up your testimony as to what you saw that backs up what the prophecy shows. And this is what Pastor is encouraging us to do, to write these dates down, to make notes of it, to put it in our book of Yahweh if need be, to write it in the back of our book of Yahweh, so that in the future it wouldn't just be, you wouldn't be just relying on the testimony of others. You will be able to witness on the scripture, witness to the prophecies, but to give your eyewitness testimony. Yes, I saw this. Yes, I witnessed this. Yes, this did take place on this particular date. I did see it with my own eyes. I did read the article for myself. You'll be able to provide that type of testimony, that evidence, to be able to give that information out. And as Pastor said, you'll thank him later on if you keep this up. In verse 11, he says, start keeping your own records. Watch the news if you can, especially here. We go through all the news to get the parts that show prophecy being fulfilled and show it to you here. And the segment of news that is shown to us, it's really small in comparison to all the news that is taking place just on a daily basis. If they really had to show everything that is taking place, we'll be in the sanctuary for hours just looking at the news on a weekly basis. But he says, start keeping your own records. Watch the news if you can, especially here. Go through all the news to get the parts that show prophecy being fulfilled and show it. He says that we go through all the news to get the parts that show prophecy being fulfilled and show it to you here. And that's the main reason the news is shown. Then he goes into verse 14 concerning the Oslo Accord and what the past president Yitzhak Rabin said. He said, Jerusalem is the heart of the Jewish people and a deep source of pride. Rabin said at an event recognizing the 3,000th year of the city's existence. Of course, he was killed, and that's shown in some of the previous articles. But then he goes into verse 16. Well, let's look at verse 15. That speech was given in the 10th Roman month on the 25th, 1995. And then it shows on the 11th Roman month on the 4th, a far-right student fatally shot him, that is Rabin. And then it says, the evening before his speech, the Congress of the United States passed a law echoing Rabin's assertions about the city. And then he says, I think I'll stop right there and we'll continue that another time. I want to get back into this prophecy about Revelation. And you're going to see that he does this several times throughout the sermon. He will start going in a particular direction, then you'll just stop right there. Then he goes into something else, and then you say, okay, that's enough of that, and then he goes into something else. So there are different things that he's covering in this one sermon, but remember, as I said, the title really gives you the main idea that he is striving to bring about. So in verse 17, he says, the news is showing the severity of the country of America, the U.S., and is showing the severity of the whole globe right now. This article says, however, one particular peculiar cause of anemia is parasite infestations. The parasites are going on big time, and anemia is when you're not producing sufficient red blood. You don't have sufficient red blood, so you're having shortness of breath, you're having weakness, it could cause a loss of color, and etc. And he's showing that these parasites, it's actually feeding on an individual's blood. The parasites is actually feeding on their blood. And of course, it's important to understand this, the necessity of us, number one, being clean and staying clean and striving to be clean. But number two, cleansing. Why we always need to be cleansing and doing the cleanses, because these parasites, they are in the environment, and if you get them in you, they will multiply, and then you'll start suffering the effects of it. In verse 18, well, let's continue in verse 17. It says, the parasites are going on big time. If you notice the recall on hamburger, ground beef yesterday, and if you keep up with the news, there's almost, I would say almost every week there's a recall of something. Almost every week there's a recall of something. I think the last recall that I noticed was romaine lettuce. There was a recall of romaine lettuce. They were saying that if it's in any, don't eat the lettuce. If it's in any mixed salad dressing type bags, throw it away and etc. Because when they recall something, it's because it's getting people sick. Or it's either not just getting people sick, but it could also be killing them. But you'll notice that the food is being recalled time after time after time, and again, that's due to the defilement. He says, those are only some of them. Walking on the beach can give them to you too. I think you ought to wear heavy boots or something if you're going to walk where the world makes their playground. And they have tested this. They have tested the sand on the beaches. They have tested the area between the surf and the shore. They have tested, some of the like seaweed and stuff that you'll see on the shore and etc. And they found tons of bacteria. Tons and tons of bacteria. Now, Pastor makes the point that you would think that with the salt water that the beach would be kosher, but it isn't. Because of the sins of mankind, you find that it's just taking over the environment. He says in verse 18, it said it was later when the children were diagnosed for anemia that the problem of parasite worms even emerged. Once these worms enter the human body, they find their way into the intestines, where they absorb all the nutrition and energy that the person assimilates. That's the harm these worms can do to your body. And part of the problem that you would experience if you do have these parasites is you'll be continually hungry, you'll be eating a lot, and still tired. Because there's something else that is digesting your food, and it's not you. It's parasites. And that's one of the reasons, again, as I said, there's a necessity for cleansing. Verse 20, science is now trying to fight the parasite-induced anemia by building what they are calling a Noah's Ark to gather and preserve the antibodies that protect your body. They want to preserve them because they're saying in this article, that the parasites could end life. They say it's a crisis. One particularly peculiar crisis of the anemia is a crisis in the U.S. and globally, and it is a parasite. The parasites get your body down to where your body starts breaking down to any disease, flu, colds, allergies, and so forth. So this is something that people are dealing with in the world. This is something that we are also dealing with, but we do have the means of getting rid of these parasites. In verse 21, in the middle of that paragraph, Pastor says, the public's immune systems are being brought down slowly and they don't notice it until diarrhea develops and their strength is gone. They are wondering why it's so hard to get out of bed in the morning, and why it's suddenly so hard to put in 8 hours a day when you're used to putting in 12 to 16. So again, we can notice this within ourselves, because you should know how you feel when you're feeling fairly well. And you should also notice the difference when when you're feeling not too well and you're just kind of dragging and it's day after day after day after day. That should be a signal that it's time to cleanse. That should bring to our mind the need for cleansing. So keep that in mind. Now in verse 22, Pastor writes, they use the word industrialization to describe the state of the world today. They rejected some of my articles. And then, funny enough, they tell us to water them down. Water them down because I'm scaring the world. I want everyone to know out there, instead of using the words nuclear explosions anymore, I'm going to call it industrialization. That seems to go through. Keep that in mind when you see this word. We will beat them at their own game. Now, what Pastor is covering here is that they're censoring some of the articles, meaning that, and he goes into details in verse 23, he says, they rejected some of the articles, we have had to change them and water them down, as I called it, in order to get them through. He says, I got a call from Google again last week, and then he goes into a little bit of what that call was about. But then in verse 24, it says, at the same time, I don't know if you remember, but the Pope came to see Google. Since that time, they started making some changes, so I know they are censoring our work. So this has been going on for some time, not just with the House of Yahweh, but they're censoring a lot of people who are bringing out information that challenges the narrative, the popular narrative in the news, or things that the government is doing, and etc. And one of the benefits that we have in the House of Yahweh that it doesn't affect us too much is that we are not doing it for monetary purposes. But people who are out there bringing out information and they're making a living out of it, especially on YouTube and some of these other places, what they encounter is that they're being told, well, look, if you don't change the content, you're going to be demonetized, meaning that we're going to take away your source of revenue. And if you have built up a channel and you have hundreds of thousands or millions of followers and you have a revenue stream coming in, and they come and tell you one day if you don't change the content, you're not going to make any money, well, this forces these people to change the content of whatever they're putting forth, especially if it's going against, whatever the government, if it's going against the government's narrative. But you could see that this also has a little bit of an effect on the House of Yahweh, but Pastor is saying, no, we're going to beat them at their own game if it's necessary for us to change certain words so that the information can go out. He's willing to do so. But, the censorship, and you see it in the news a lot where they're talking to the tech companies that they need to censor their platforms, that they shouldn't be having hateful speech or hateful language or anything that offends anyone or hurts somebody else or hurtful language and etc., that they need to do something to curtail that, but also be a reminder that could also affect the work of Yahweh, and it's something that it's possible that if Yahweh were to allow it, that it could use against the House of Yahweh and have been using, as Pastor made mention of here. So in verse 26, Pastor goes on to talk about the crisis that took place one time before when 90% of their cardinals got wiped out. And this was during the period of the Black Plague. And he says, what brought about the Black Plague was a wound with a sword not burying the dead. They were killing them but not burying them fast enough. That created what they are creating right now also, parasites that your body cannot handle. It's a crisis right now, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. He says the beaches are unsafe to walk on anymore. Even though they got salt water washing up on them all the time, they are still unsafe to walk on due to man's filthiness and not being taught the laws of cleanliness that are shown in the scriptures. And this is something that you see, if in times past go to these places, you'll understand, what Pastor is talking about. And then not too long ago, he gave a very graphic example of how filthy these beaches can actually be. You talk about laying that beach towel down in the sand and then something soaking up through the sand through the towel and what it was. But even worse than that, if in certain places, and I can remember as a young man and on some beaches, you could see that stuff just floating in the water. While you're out there, because people just use the restroom right in the water. And it's just something that you wouldn't think of, but it just goes to show how defiled the earth is. Let's look down to verse 29. He was talking about being 12 when he was raised back in Oklahoma and, cutting the broom corn at that time. And in verse 29, it says, after we would eat dinner, we would sit around for a while, rest and talk. It says, at that time in Oklahoma, the scriptures were read by a lot of people. There was no entertainment, there was no televisions, and no telephones. There was not much electricity to begin with out in the country. So you could see that it was really an environment that allowed him to focus on the scriptures, because the scriptures, he said, that was the entertainment at the time. People read the scriptures, they talk about the scriptures. And he said at the age of 12, he was able to discuss the scriptures with adults. And he said that one of them said in verse 30, he says, this boy knows more about the scriptures than all of us. And he was 12 at that time, and this is what an adult was saying at that time. Let's look at verse 35. Matthew 24:7 says, in this generation, it's going to be the worst of everything. The disease epidemics will be the worst ever. If you read the history of the Black Plague, that alone wiped out millions and millions of people. It was also the wound with the sword, caused by the sword, by war, that wiped out all these people. It wiped out so many Catholic cardinals, it hit them harder than it did the rest of the world. And then he says in verse 36, imagine what could be worse than that time. And he says, at this time, that wound with the sword also opened the way to get the book of Yahweh. Let's go to page 338. And we'll look at verse 42 here. He says, let's be turning over to Matthew. I want to read you this, what your king is saying about you. Then we'll go into this horrifying junk. In Matthew 25, verse 34, then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, you blessed of my father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me. And Pastor says, we are doing all these things. Is there anything mentioned that we didn't do this past feast? Are you part of it? Yes, you are. You are part of it. The king is talking to you. I don't think it's ever been possible before. They had a little bit of it throughout history, a little bit of it at a time. Those kinds of things didn't satisfy the moneymakers, so they didn't last for long. They are being done full-time now at the House of Yahweh. And what I want everyone to note about this verse and the other verses that the priests will be covering, the next speaker, is that Matthew 25, verses 34, 35, 36, all the way through 40 is talking about us in the house of Yahweh at this time. And he's saying that we are actually fulfilling this. These are the things that we are doing, and Yeshua is speaking to us. So that should be really encouraging to all of us. So I'll ask for everyone to please stand at this time. Now I have the pleasure and opportunity to present the next speaker, the great Kahan Zephaniah Hawkins. Praise Yahweh.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Please be seated. Yahweh's peace and blessings be with each and every one of you. Well, we are going to continue where the great Kahan left off on page 338, exactly with the same point that he left off with. These scriptures are speaking of us. They're written for us. I'd like you to look at verse 51. And Pastor says here, most of the Holy Scriptures were written about us, as you're going to see plainly. Revelations 13:10. And Revelations 13:10 keys us back to that title here of this sermon that we're covering. which I'd like to read one more time, which is, it's a must for world war to prove what sin brings. This message goes to all. And I remember, one thing that I vividly remember as a young child before I moved down here to the House of Yahweh, I remember, in Wisconsin, we were on the sermon tape list. We received the tape in the mail. It came about 5, but usually 6 days after the sermon was given. So, say, for instance, the sermon that was given last Sabbath, we would receive that on the preparation day. And I remember, looking at the titles always on those cassette tapes. And since that time, the titles have always been something that stood out to me, seeing that, the food of the Spirit, making the connection with Yahweh, the planned genealogies. And it's like the heading of the outline. And as the Great Khan was saying, you see Pastor's main point there given in that title. And that's really what the rest of this sermon, the second half that we're going to cover, is all focused around that title, Revelations 13:10, that it's a must. It's a must for mankind to see what sin brings, and also for every ear, for all of mankind to hear about this. The message goes to all. And that's that one verse there that's put right there between those two beasts in Revelation chapter 13. So let's continue on to verse 52. We'll look at Matthew 7:12. And, these are the words of our great high priest, Yeshua. And he says, this also, the Savior speaking, he says, therefore, all things you want men to do to you, do the same to them. For this is the teaching of the law and the prophets. Now notice how Pastor sums this up. He says, the whole combination of Yahweh's laws and prophets fulfills this right here. Right there. The whole combination. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is what Yeshua just said. And then he said, verse 13, we'll enter in through the narrow gate. And we're going to concentrate a little bit here on these scriptures, verses 13 and 14. This narrow gate. Well, that's what you're doing. You search for it first. Yes, you search for it. As we know, you seek the place. Well, the House of Yahweh is the only authorized organization that can bring forth this message of peace, the message of Yahweh's kingdom. We'll seek first the kingdom of Yahweh. That means the House of Yahweh. I will make you a kingdom of priests. And back in 2004, when Pastor was going over Psalm chapter 82, he's been covering that as well quite a bit lately, talking about Jupiter and the court system that's taking place there, and how Yahweh, he counsels and he shows these gods, the way that they're going is not right. And in that sermon, the date was 1/3/2004, if you want to go back and look at it, but Pastor went over the definition of a priest and what a priest is. And I wrote it here, and I'd like to, if you have your book of Yahweh, you can turn over to Psalm chapter 82. And I just want to cover it here because this is, this kingdom of priests, this is what we're all about. I will make you a kingdom of priests. Speaking of his house, I will make you a kingdom of priests. And Pastor said, a priest here. He said to guard Yahweh's creation, guard and keep. Follow his instruction, an honorable worker, ready to take on any task, takes care of needs, guards the food supply. Remember, guard and keep. Authorized minister, ministering to the needs of others, serving Yahweh's people. And he explained that in there. It was an excellent sermon in going over there this kingdom of priests and what we must fit into to be a part of it. So let's continue here. He said, that's who you are. When he says kingdom, it's talking about you. You're going to be the first fruits, the cluster that's in the promised land that's actually flowing with milk and honey. Yes, always, eternally. Put it all together, and you'll see this beautiful picture that Yahweh has painted for you. And in verse 54 here, verse 13 of Matthew chapter 7, we'll enter in through that narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction. And remember, Destruction ties into Revelation 13, verse 10. It's a must that this destruction come. And, Pastor talks about this, that we see going on in that fourth part of the earth. For some of mankind who are not in that fourth part of the earth, Pastor said, it's kind of like watching a movie. You just see it afar off, and you don't really think it's anywhere near. But I guarantee you, for those people living there, you can see the anguish on their faces as we watch the news and see what they're going through living in that fourth part of the earth, and the running for their lives, fathers grabbing their sons and tucking them under their arm and, to get out of there. I mean, it's a terrible situation there, but that's the destruction that sin brings. And at the bottom of that verse there in 54, it's all going to come to a showdown with Damascus. And we know that prophecy there. And the heap of waste that city is going to be, along with those who don't get out and come to the house of Yahweh. Well, verse 56, because straight is the gate. The boundaries, Yahweh set the boundaries there. We're given the boundaries in the laws. Follow these things. Stay on that straight and narrow, and this will be your guide. This will be your protection. But the whole time, what's taking place? Well, Satan's trying to pull us off a little bit here or there, deter us, derail us a little bit. That's what's taking place. That's her goal. But Yahweh says here, our high priest told us, straight, enter in through that narrow gate. And we know that's the house of Yahweh. That's the only way to the kingdom. Tie that into Revelations 22, verse 14. Because straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leads to life. You can't get off of it. You can't vary from the right to the left. Remember what Deuteronomy 17:11 says. And that tells us, follow those instructions. Don't go to the right nor to the left of it. Well, you can't vary to the right or left. You've got to do what the priest says. And this is why the kingdom of priests that Yahweh is putting together is based on unity. It's a body, a unified body that will bring this peace, that will bring the righteous judgments and decisions and keep mankind and Yahweh's creation from suffering the way that we see that they're going right now, that we're witnessing in these last days. Well, let's look at verse 58. If you look over across the page there on 339, who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. They come and they say, look, we want to protect your rights. Well, we want people to get behind us, and teach the peaceful solution, to teach this message that's going to bring peace. That's what we need. We need people bringing peace here and getting behind the message that the house of Yahweh is bringing forth. Well, they kill, they murder, they are for war, and this must be. Those that are for war, it's a must. And there you see it, as Pastor uses the scriptures there, it's a must, as Yahweh said, that they die by war, by man, not by Yahweh. And it's important for us to get rid of any desire that we have to want to retaliate, vengeance, get even, even if it's with our tongue and saying something, in retaliation. We have to get rid of that evil like the gods mentality. That way of war is not going to be present in Yahweh's kingdom. And we need to get rid of it. Well, verse 16 here, you will know them by their fruits. You see it in their actions. That's what Yeshua said. You may think you know all of this right here. Now, this is where, it should perk your ears up right here. Pastor says, but get it in your mind, and I'll show you don't. There are many other things you need from this here. And these are these things as you go over the sermons, you go over them and you see the little bits and pieces here that Pastor gives us. Well, you will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorns or figs from thistles? That is a cluster. Is Yahweh gathering his cluster, his last days ones, who are first from thorn bushes? No. No, he's gathering them from his house. I'll make my house a kingdom of priests. My house will not be overcome by Satan. The gates of hell won't prevail with the deception. And that's our promise. We're the only group, the only house of Yahweh to have that promise given to us, that the gates of hell will not prevail. Let's look at page 340. There are several points here that I want to cover. Verse 63, and this is a continuation here in Matthew chapter 7. And if you have your book of Yahweh, it's always great to make the references or the notes and so forth if you don't have your book of Israel. Verse 18, a righteous tree cannot bring forth iniquity. A righteous tree. It reminds me here of a righteous branch, as we see one of the prophets, the prophet Jeremiah, spoke about, Jeremiah 23, verse 5. Behold, the days come. Well, which days? Which days come? Could it be the last days here? Says Yahweh, that I will raise to David a righteous branch. Notice, what kind of branch? A righteous branch. And a king. So you have a branch and a king. Will reign and succeed and will execute judgment and justice in the earth. Okay, and you can tie that into Isaiah 11, verse 1, also speaking about the branch. But you see this here now in Matthew chapter 7, verse 18. A righteous tree cannot bring forth fruit of iniquity. It can't, pastor says. We can't. I can't teach iniquity. I can't teach you that the laws are done away with. I can't teach you to practice sin. I tell you, don't do it. Don't even put your foot down in it. You see the righteous branch there, the righteous tree, can't bring forth iniquity. He teaches us Yahweh's truth. Nor can a tree of evil, evil like the gods, bring forth fruit of righteousness. Verse 19, every tree which does not bring forth fruit is cut down and cast into the fire. Period. Fire for burning. It's cast into the fire. Remember, they create their own lake of fire. They create their own lake of fire through their actions, through the sin that they're generating right now. Well, this is the house of the gods, as Pastor says here. Okay, let's look down at verse 68. So he goes over here to Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 17. Verse 68 here, bottom of page 340. Well, Yahweh says, but if your heart turns away, if your heart turns away, and we've heard quite a few sermons lately about the heart, putting Yahweh's laws there. It has to be a love, a desire. If your heart turns away, your heart, that is where the lust and the cravings come from. This mind that sits in your chest. And if you think of the films that we've seen on this, and this magnificent organ there that has a brain that controls our desire, and it's what we feed into it. If you think of it, there's a certain storage capacity. The more righteousness we put in there, the more evil gets pushed out. But if it's the other way, well, the less righteousness that's going to be there. Well, they're not up here. They're not up here in your brain, referring to those desires. The heart sends a signal up to your brain, but it actually sits here in your chest. It creates desires for righteousness if you feed it righteousness. It creates desires for illegal lusts if you feed it with the television sets and entertainment from Hollywood. And Pastor goes into, he tells another story here of the time when he was 12 years old working in the broom cornfield when someone brought a funny book to him. Okay, it was a funny book that, and he said he looked at it and he read it, and he realized, he said, why would you read this? What does this, what is this about? There's no benefit. And Pastor said, if you look at the bottom there of verse 70, he said, but I said they were time wasting, they were no benefit. And again, Satan has a lot of things that can waste our time. Just waste our time to keep us from reading and studying and filling that righteousness there in our heart that we need. Pastor said, I knew this in verse 71. He said, I had that knowledge at a very young age. I knew I was 12 years old when that incident occurred. You could do the same thing, you young people. Get your mindset on righteousness. Don't let people lead you to sin. You lead them into righteousness. Think about what your mother and your dad have taught you. Get your mind set on righteousness, and you'll have your place in the kingdom. You'll have your place in the kingdom forever. You're a part of the greatest work of history. You're it. We're it, brethren. It's us right here. We're it. You're going to be first in this great kingdom that was prophesied and was in the plan. Revelation 13:10, that's what it means. The plan of Yahweh. I'll show you that. And that is what this is all about here. This plan, these scriptures written for us right now. Right now we're living it. We're living it. This whole plan comes down right now to this last time period. Hey, we're seeing, we're witnessing. Verse 17, but if your heart turns away and you are not obedient and you are drawn away to submit to God's. You're drawn? You see that? Well, how are you drawn? It comes from the heart. It comes from the heart. It comes from what we allow in our hearts. Well, Satan feeds your heart with illegal lusts. This is what you should be doing. This is fun. Think. And I tell myself this. Think, Sophania. Come on, think. Think. And it makes me realize, the stop and think. Stop and think. And if we would just stop and think and consider, do I really want to do this here? Do I really want to say this? Would this be something that I'm going to regret later? So think, Pastor says. And then he says here this, and I find this very ironic, this next sentence here or two. He says, you could get out here on this crowded highway and you could get shot. That's the ongoing thing right now, shooting from one vehicle to another. Now, do you realize that just this afternoon this took place right out here on the highway? This very thing that we're covering right here this evening took place. There was a vehicle driving by, shot at another vehicle and hit someone. This very thing. To me, that's too ironic. We're covering it here in the class. Is that not Yahweh making a point to us? He says, think. You could get in a wreck or so forth. The safety is right here. Yes, right here in the house of Yahweh. Well, to submit, in continuing, he says from verse 17, to submit to gods. Remember, if your heart is turned away and you're drawn away to submit to these gods. Well, you didn't know you were submitting to gods when you partook of these things. Yes, you are. You're submitting to gods. Now listen to this right here. Anytime you take part in this world, you're submitting to gods. That's why Yahweh says, don't dress like them, don't talk like them, don't walk like them, don't eat with them. Stay away from the world. Stay away from those people that follow these things, practice these things. That includes their entertainment. Their entertainment most of all. Most of all, their entertainment. It's time wasting. It's meant to deter us. It's meant to get us off from our studies. It's Satan's attempt to get the righteous ones to throw us off track. That's what it's designed to do. That's all it's designed to do. It's to get us to waste time and to turn us from Yahweh. To submit to gods, well, that is what you do when you don't keep this straight and narrow. When you keep this straight and narrow, Yeshua can say to the heavens, look how straight this boy or this girl is. But if you don't remain straight and your heart is led astray and you give in, you break your connection with Yahweh. And you break your connection with Yahweh. That's what Adam and Eve did. And what was it that Yahweh noticed about Adam and Eve? They didn't show up for services. They didn't make their appointments. Where were they? They were supposed to be right here getting the message. Right here getting that message. But that's what Adam and Eve did. They broke their connection with Yahweh. That's the reason the world is killing babies. Pastor goes on here and says, if we do the same thing, we're all part of that. We're grouped together with that. So he says, stay away from it. Don't submit to these gods. Keep our minds. We need to keep them focused on righteousness and on putting this righteousness within our hearts. Verse 18, it's actually verse 77, but verse 18, I declare you, and this is of Deuteronomy chapter 30, where Yahweh says, here it's your choice, but I'm telling you, choose this way. I declare to you this day that you will surely perish. Surely. And he says, Isaiah 24, 1 through 6. And we know what that is. You know, Yahweh allowed the earth to be made empty. Yahweh didn't make the earth empty or make it waste. You know, the only thing Yahweh made with the earth was absolute perfect. Yahweh made it perfect. Mankind, through their wickedness and through their evil that they practiced, made it defiled and unrighteous, what we see today. So let's turn there and get that combination with what you just read here in Deuteronomy. So if you turn the page here, well, Yahweh allowed it to be made empty, and it makes waste, perverts the face of it. Now let's look down at verse 81. And if you remember, the last part of this, the title that we covered, I'm going to turn back there. This message goes to all. So the first part was, it's a must for world war to prove what sin, it's a must for world war to prove what sin brings. This message goes to all. Okay, so it's kind of two parts here. We're going to see this, the second part here, this message goes to all. Verse 81. Now this is verse 2 of Isaiah 24. And it will be as with the people, so with the priests. Now look at the extent Yahweh goes through here as he lays this out, who this is all going to entail. As with the people, so with the priest. As with the servant, so with his owner. All of them, no one is left out. It goes to extremes to show you that. You know, Yahweh does these things. He writes the scriptures. He allowed the scriptures to be written in a certain way to stress certain points, like that word must. Well, he's doing it right here as he goes through all this. So why is he saying all the borrower and him who gives usury and all this and that? Pastor's explaining it right here. It goes to extremes to show you no one is left out. Remember, Pastor said the way that Yahweh has designed this thing, everyone, all of mankind will realize that this destruction was caused by sin, by rejecting Yahweh's way. The dumbest person, Pastor said, you know, and I know he's not calling anybody dumb, but he's saying everybody is going to see that sin is what caused this destruction and brought the earth to this point. The borrower, so with him who gives usury to him, the lenders, it means everybody. And everybody's going to be affected by these wars. You know, we will see, you know, we're going to see what sin brings. He always said, you know, 1,000 at your left hand, 10,000 at your right, but it won't come near you. It won't come near you. That's Yahweh's promise to us. And what a great promise that is. What a great promise. You know, praise be to Father Yahweh for giving us that promise that it won't come near you. The land will be utterly emptied and utterly plundered, for Yahweh has spoken this word. You know, it's not going to be changed. Yahweh has spoken it. It's coming to pass. Let's look at verse 88. Well, we're in Isaiah 24, 1 through 6. And notice what Pastor says here, the great fall. It's the great fall of mankind. You know, they're going to fall on their face. Because if he wouldn't allow them to take this all the way to the point of where mankind is just about completely wiped out, mankind would always be able to say, well, you know, you stepped in there a little bit too soon. We would have had it. You know, we could have fixed it. We could have figured it out. But he's going to let them go all the way to that point where, as the scriptures say there, just about all hope of life is gone if Yahweh won't step in. And he's going to do that for his work's sake. We'll turn over to Revelation 13. What I just read you, it's speaking of the warning. Okay? So, as mankind is about ready to fall on their face here, the great fall that we see in Isaiah 24, 1 through 6, Pastor says, let's look at Revelation 13 here, what I just read. Speaking of this warning, it's speaking of our warning to the world. I want you to notice here in Revelation 13 where he put in this verse 10. Okay? And as Great Kahan mentioned, you know, right there you look in chapter 13 and you see this first beast spoken of, and then you have verse 13, and then after that it's the next beast, and right there in the middle, Yahweh puts this verse 10 here for us. If you look at verse 89, he said, and he puts this verse 10 right there in the middle between these two beasts. Okay, let's look over at 91, and he's going to finish explaining it to us. But this right here, Revelation 13, start with verse 9. If any man, you see that? If any man. Well, look at that word there in that verse. Pay attention to that word. What does that word any mean? It means all. It means all. It means everyone with an ear. It means this message that you are taking out to all the world goes to all the world and everyone in the world with an ear. Anyone can hear. This is what it's showing you. So that warning, and what other work has been able to accomplish that? There isn't. There hasn't been another work. We're the only ones that have been able to accomplish this. This is the first time in history, Pastor says here, this has ever taken place. No one has ever been able to reach the world before. In 1934, the year I was born, that's the year technology started and enabled everyone with an ear to hear. Everyone with an ear, well, that covers them all, unless you're deformed and you don't have ears, and I've never known of any person that didn't have at least one ear. Think of what it's saying here. That scripture couldn't have been for anyone else but the house of Yahweh. And remember what we started with when Pastor said these scriptures were what? Written for us. They're all for us. They're written, it's speaking about us right now in these last days. They couldn't have been for anyone else but the house of Yahweh to take this message to the world at this time. We take it to the whole world, not just one or two, but to everyone with an ear. Everyone with an ear is going to hear this message. All ears will hear. Another scripture says all eyes, but that also means all ears. All eyes are on the house of Yahweh at this time. And remember, Pastor has explained that with the sea of glass and how it's like an open book there for Yahweh's creation to see, this plan coming to pass. And I was going to mention the scripture there in Genesis where Yahweh says, as we were talking about the heart, how he said, that in the time of Noah, where he said the thoughts, the intents of man's heart was evil continually. And then it says Yahweh regretted what he did. Yahweh didn't regret what he did. Yahweh took comfort in his plan, that he had a plan, and that this plan is going to be right now in these last days that's going to put a stop to the sin. And that's what that scripture truly means there. Yahweh took comfort in seeing his plan come together. Okay, let's finish it up in verse 94. Well, the Pope is out to try to stop us. Remember that in your prayers. Okay, pray for the work. Pray for the work. Be a part of the work as you are. Be a part of the work. Bring it forth. Help us bring it forth. That's the righteousness there. That's the righteousness there that fills our heart up. Bring it forth. Help us to bring it forth. Become a teacher of Yahweh's righteousness. Become a teacher of Yahweh's righteousness, and you'll live forever, and you'll enjoy this kingdom where there is no harm done to anyone and where every need is met. Yahweh bless your understanding. Praise Yahweh for Yahweh's last day's witness and his great inspired words for us.